Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second keynote. And it's become a tradition. And when I say tradition, I mean, we tried this out last year and it worked very well, to have one academic and one artistic keynote. Because as a field, cultural expressions and just the creation of culture is an important part of the humanities. So to have both an academic and an artistic keynote kind of serves different parts of the field. And this year, we have asked Jordan Magnuson to come and hold the artistic, but also a bit academic, because we also asked him to kind of think about interface as a concept when talking today. So we've asked Jordan Magnuson, who is a game designer and media artist, whose work explores how video games can express human experience in poetic and culturally resonant ways. So for over 15 years, he has created award-winning independent games, such as game poems, and other interactive works. And he is the editor of the new online digital literary magazine, Game Poems, dedicated to exploring the artistic and poetic potential of short-form video games. And also, if some of you here have played Papers, Please or Minecraft, this guy had something to do with it in an infrastructural way. Yeah, so without further ado, welcome.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, microphone is working and whatnot. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. Yeah, I'm currently based at the Winchester School of Art in the University of Southampton. And as the art school affiliation might give away, that yes, as Camilla was saying, I'm a maker. I come to you not as a traditional academic, but from what I consider to be sometimes the wild west of creative practice. And I can tell the aura is emanating because there's this nice bunch of empty seats here in the middle in front of me. You know, it's like, you don't want to get too close. That's probably, could be for the best. But yeah, so my background, as Camilla said, is in independent game design. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been focused specifically on experimental game design, which is, as the name implies, the practice of making games as a form of experiment. So I ask questions like, what are different ways that metaphor can function in video games at the most basic level? Or can story be conveyed through simple game mechanics without relying on text or recognizable images? Or can games make use of electronic literature conventions? What does that look like? Can games be used as a form of travel writing? When is a game no longer a game? Can video games be poems, right? And then I try to make games that speak to these questions. So I recently wrote a book about games being poems, and so the interplay of video games and poetry has become something of a specialty for me. So what I want to talk about today is how thinking of poems and games broadly in terms of interfaces can help us move beyond rigid conceptions of digital poetry, right? And towards this notion of Born-Videogame Poetics. And also how interface thinking impacts the implications of this move. In other words, the question of what's at stake here. Why does it matter if video games can be poems? And as I said, I'm a maker, so hold on to your hats. This could be a little bit bumpy. I'm going to be drawing a bunch of disparate things together, maybe playing a bit fast and loose with some concepts, but I hope in a way that provides at least some interesting food for thought, right? Both to digital culture scholars and also hopefully practitioners as well. And I might throw in a little injunction, just to spice things up a little bit. So you can look forward to that. Okay, so quick content warning before we get going. Some flashing images on these slides, and I'll be talking about games that feature sensitive topics. Okay, that warning out of the way, I'll start by telling you a little bit more about myself and how I became interested in this intersection of games and poetry. My entryway into making experimental games was really making games as a form of personal expression. About 15 years ago, notably before my beard grew in, I started making little games about the things I was seeing and experiencing in my daily life, basically, right? Games that tried to capture things like, my experience of fleeting beauty on a crisp autumn day. I want to make a game about that, or on the other side, that attempted to express something of my experience of loneliness during periods of deep depression. Games about traveling, games about difficult political realities, games about mundane tasks that nevertheless seem somehow sacred, like caring for the gravesite of a loved one who's passed on. Right, and in recent years, games inspired by my experience of parenthood. These little expressive games I make utilize very simple graphics most of the time, and they typically take less than 5 minutes to play through. They don't require Twitch reactions. They don't tend to have clear rules or objectives. They're not challenging usually in a typical video game sort of way, but maybe in other ways. They're games about slowing down, paying attention, being present in the moment, and sort of seeing the world with new eyes or seeing something in a fresh light. And somewhere along the way, I became interested in thinking about these games through the lens of poetry. And it might have been because, some of these games started getting passed around a little bit. Critics would sometimes talk about them as being quote unquote poetic, sometimes in the context of discussing similar games from other creators. Some of you may be familiar with games like Jason Rohr's Passage, or Ian Bogost's Slow Year, or Tale of Tales, The Graveyard. But what it actually meant for these games to be poetic or why it mattered was never really very clear. Throwing around the word poetic felt mostly like admitting a loss for words, right? Where I was looking for specific language to talk about my creative practice. Now, the idea that video games might be poems is not an idea that has seen a lot of consideration in game studies, much less in the broader culture. Right? When scholars have occasionally compared video games and poetry, they've generally arrived at heartwarming conclusions like, poetry may never take the shape of a video game. Absolutely not. And now, of course, within electronic literature, digital poetry has been a vibrant creative field for some time. And if we dig around a bit, we can find some examples of digital poems that connect certain video game conventions with poetic intention. Things like Jim Andrews' Artoroids, that's sort of a word-based version of the classic Asteroids game. Or Jason Nelson's Game, and Again game, which is self-described as a digital poem and retro game. But most of these examples are contingent on the idea, right, that the chief thread connecting digital and computational poetry to written and oral poetry traditions, right, is the thread of linguistic sounds and symbols, right, words and language. But video games as poems without the use of poetic language, that's basically a no-go, right? An outrage against decorum, to quote game scholar Piotr Kubiński, which I love this phrase, an outrage against decorum, right? That's games and poetry. Video games are games, right? Not poems. And I think what this shows us is the limitations of thinking in terms of categories and taxonomies, right? We have these two categories here, video games made up of computer code and moving images, and poems made up of words, and never the twain shall meet, right? All we can imagine is that if they're, in terms of their synthesis, right, is that if we push really hard to try to bring these categories together, we can get a little sliver of overlap here in the realm of digital poetry, as long as video games can very literally remediate, right, poetry's native medium of words. So as scholars like Stanley Fish have pointed out, right, we pay a certain kind of attention to something we consider to be a poem and a very different kind of attention to something we consider to be a video game. And I think this is where thinking in terms of interfaces rather than taxonomies can help us. Now, obviously, the word interface has been used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways to talk about a lot of different sorts of things, right? We have everything from literal control panels and screens to philosophical and aesthetic thresholds. And what I want to draw on here is the digital humanities tradition of thinking of interfaces in relation to texts and media, but as broad sites of mediation, right? As developed by scholars like Lev Manovich, Catherine Hales, and Alexander Galloway. Galloway in The Interface Effect writes, an interface is not something that appears before you, but rather a gateway that opens up and allows passage to some place beyond. And I love that phrasing, the idea of a gateway or threshold, because it shifts our attention away from the interface as a visible surface, right, and toward the kind of passage it makes possible. Right. For me, this isn't just a theoretical lens, it's a way of thinking about how I make things, right, of noticing what kinds of experiences my games mediate, right, and how they might mediate different kinds of experiences. If we consider poems and video games, these things are clearly, on the one hand, objects, right? They do appear before us, right, on paper or on a screen. Right, but when we step back from the specific examples and look at poems and games broadly speaking, right, they're also examples of different types of gateways and thresholds, right, that open up and allow passage to, some place beyond. And notably, they are generally gateways to very different sorts of places, right, very different sorts of experiences. Poems, broadly speaking, and I'm thinking here especially of lyric poetry, and I'll come back to that, mediate subjective and intimate human experience, right? They open gateways to things like memory, emotion, reflection, personal call to action. When we think of, in the domain of poetry, I often think of this quote I love from Annie Dillard, "Why does death so catch us by surprise, and why love?" The kind of terrain that poetry leads us into. All right, video games, by contrast, have historically mediated fast action, outer world experience, right? Spaceships flying, rackets hitting balls, avatars colliding in space, right? They often seem to be about building things, collecting things, and especially blowing things up. So when we think of games and poems as formal categories, it's easy to get caught up in the material differences between media, which leads us towards this impasse where video games can't be poems because they don't incorporate enough poetic words. But if we shift from category thinking to interface thinking, if we stop thinking, what is this thing, and start asking, what kind of gateway does it open? I think that actually helps us to break down the impasse. Because it's not that hard to imagine that the basic building blocks of video games could be reconfigured as gateways to other kinds of experiences than what they've traditionally mediated. In this light, imagining video games as poems isn't about games needing to suddenly incorporate poetic text or wordplay in order to sort of masquerade as poems. Right, rather, it's about using the native properties of video games, their operational logics, their rhythms of interaction, their capacities they already have for ambiguity to mediate poetic expression. Now, if we want to reconfigure the interface of video games to look more like the interface of poetry, then we need some way to think about what you might call the interface architecture, I suppose, of each one. All right, by which I mean the underlying design logics or mediating structures that shape how each form creates passage and experience. For video games, we might turn here to the concept of operational logics, as defined by computational media scholars Noah Wardrop-Fruin and Michael Mateus. Operational logics are a unit of analysis concerned with the meaning of such basic things as collision detection, avatar movement, and resource counters, essential video game elements that, like words, can be used and reused in a variety of games in a variety of contexts. Are people familiar with operational logics? Is this something people have run across? Not so much, maybe? Okay, just curious. At a macro level, right, operational logics help us to discuss why basic video game building blocks are associated over and over again with particular types of meaning, right? So for example, in video games, sprites overlapping on screen, right, which is collision detection, even the word collision detection, right? It's almost always used to represent physical objects colliding in the world of human meaning, right? So why is that, right? Sprites overlapping on screen don't automatically have to have any kind of connection to objects colliding in physical space, right? Are there alternative possibilities for these logics? We'll come back to this, right? Now, if operational logics are one way to describe how video games mediate experience, lyric tendencies or lyric characteristics are one way to describe how poems mediate experience. We might be less used to thinking of poems as interfaces than video games, since we often talk about interfaces, of course, in the context of new media and computer screens. But of course, Catherine Hales reminds us in Writing Machines that all texts are interfaces, thresholds between material form, right, and embodied readers. The poem in this sense is a sort of machine for mediation, right? Its typography, line breaks, rhythm, pacing, its very particular use of devices like metaphor, hyperbole, poetic address, right? All structure the reader's passage between language and feeling, language and meaning, language and felt experience as they read the poem. So the question then becomes, can these traits and tendencies of poetry, what I will call the interface architecture of lyric poetry, be made to operate in video games? And that's what I want to examine now, drawing on part one of my book as a guide. And I will mention here that this book is completely open access. So if you want to dive into any of this in a little bit deeper way, right, you can grab a free copy from gamepoemsbook.com. So first of all, why do I keep referencing lyric poetry? Well, as a reminder, right, lyric poetry is basically what we talk about when we talk about poetry most of the time in the Western world, at least, right? It just rules out things like long epic poems and the most experimental forms of poetry, right? And I'm going to skip this slide actually due to time. Let's check how, yeah. So what is lyric poetry and how does it work? It's relatively easy to sketch, a quote unquote interface architecture of lyric poetry thanks to the work of a myriad of poetry scholars, people like Virginia Jackson, Jonathan Culler. You can say things like, right, lyric poems are short, lyric poems are bound to metaphor and ambiguous imagery, they're hyperbolic, they're subjective, they make use of poetic address, they exist in a ritual space rather than narrative space, and they juxtapose signifying meaning with material meaning. Now, it's important to note that all of these are just tendencies, right? Not hard and fast rules, but they're well-established tendencies within lyric poetry. So again, the question is, can these lyric characteristics, can this lyric interface be made to operate in video games, right? Even video games that don't feature any words. This is a question I've been exploring with my game making practice for many years at this point, and also looking out for in other games. So we start at the top of this list with something very simple. This idea that lyric poems are short doesn't seem all that exciting. I've already mentioned that many of my games only take 4 or 5 minutes to play through. This is a clip from my game, Loneliness, which explores a single emotion through the barest possible mechanics, right? You move around, you see groups of squares interacting in different ways. you approach them, they flee. There's a little bit of an arc, and then after a bit, the game is over. So what, right? What difference does it make that these games are short? Why does it matter? Well, I would argue that poems being short is actually an important part of what makes them poetic interfaces. You can see this if you compare lyric poetry to longer forms, right? Like epic poetry, the novel, right? We're talking about the difference that of something that takes hours to read or listen to versus something that takes minutes, right? So the contrast is quite striking and helps us to recognize that the short length of lyric poems, far from being accidental, right, plays an important part in establishing the lyric as a recognizable kind of interface, a gateway to something compact and potent. And this idea becomes even more striking in relation to video games, where, as you probably know, many popular games take 50 to 100 hours or more to play through. All right, so in this landscape, people are often puzzled or disappointed by short games, right? For a video game audience interested in things like entertainment, challenge, narrative, and what have you, it's hard not to read a too short game as anything but a rather obvious failure, which is a perspective you see clearly expressed here in Marcus Rickert's interactive parody of Jason Rohr's short Memento Mori game, Passage. Has anyone played Passage? Are people familiar? Have you heard of Passage? No, maybe a couple of people. Okay, I try to basically keep it, since we have limited time, limited examples. I'll be talking about a couple of games from my own practice, a couple of games that are a bit more well known. So hopefully you might recognize some of them, but if not, I'll try to explain the games a little bit as we go. So when it comes to video games, people often see a short length as limiting or as outright unacceptable. Right, but read through the lens of lyric poetry, the short length of games like Passage or Loneliness, right, is not an accident or a failure at the level of narrative or gameplay or entertainment, right, but actually an important characteristic that positions these games as lyric interfaces in video game form. Works that want to be read not once, but many times, right? Works that defy you to read them and not have plenty of time for reflection. Works that beg you to pay attention and consider their every sound, every image, every interaction, right? Just like lyric poems have always done. But let's move on to something maybe a little bit more interesting and look at how lyric poems utilize metaphor and ambiguous imagery as part of their DNA and how that might map to games, right? So metaphor at a basic level is just one thing compared to another thing, right? And lyric poems push back against indexical realism, against literalism, right? They rely instead on metaphor and establish ambiguous meaning via image, context, and comparison, right? So you have things like the famous, maybe slightly cliched metaphor, now hope is the thing with feathers, for example, right? It takes this abstract concept of hope, gives it feathers, makes it this animated, moving, living, physical thing, right? This is what metaphor does. It enriches words and concepts, helps us to see things in a new light, right? Video games have always had this dream of being gateways to very literal sorts of experiences. Right? They've always had this desire to achieve, higher and higher fidelity and sound rendering, graphics rendering, physics rendering, right? To get to this point where you're in this sort of hyper realism, right? Where you don't need metaphor at all. There's no use for metaphor, right? You're this person running around in this environment with a gun. What you see is what you get, right? But game poems can work outside of this literalist paradigm, right? By intentionally utilizing simple visuals, foregrounding metaphor, and seeking to make the familiar unfamiliar in the way that poetry does. Right. So as an example, I'll talk about Dysphoria, which is a short game by Anthropy about gender dysphoria and the experience of transitioning. And most of the games I'm going to mention today, right, don't utilize text, again, because I'm interested in this idea of Born-Videogame Poetics that isn't focused on words. But I do want to give one example of how game poems can use text strategically alongside other components, which is what Dysphoria does. Right, so Dysphoria is made up of a series of mini-games that cleverly force a comparison between the semantic meaning of a given word or phrase and the interactive representational meaning of the given minigame itself. So as an example, in the first minigame, we're presented with something that looks like it's sort of a classic puzzle game sort of puzzle, right? We have to figure out how to move or reshape our avatar to get through this barrier. But it quickly becomes clear that the challenge is impossible with the tool set that the game gives us, right? And as this realization hits us, we're presented with this text. I feel weird about my body. So our abstract interactive experience, right, must now be reinterpreted in light of this text, and the text itself has to be interpreted in light of this interactive experience, right? And in the process, I'd say the abstract representation, the interactive experience, and the text itself are all enriched, right? The perplexing angular shape of the avatar takes on new meaning, right, when juxtaposed with the word body, and the word body takes on new meaning as well. Right, we're worlds away from this. And just to reiterate, of course, you don't have to use text in order to resist literalism or emphasize metaphor in games. As one example, my game Freedom Bridge plays with metaphoric meaning by comparing a square and some red pixels to a recognizable image of barbed wire. Okay, so move on and consider the next lyric characteristic here, hyperbole, right? So broadly speaking, there are two kinds of hyperbole at work in lyric poems, right? First of all, we have explicit hyperbole, and this is what most people are aware of when Anne Bradstreet writes, I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, right? So this is hyperbole as a kind of exaggeration. And now video games don't have much patience with hyperbole, right? For video games that are interested in very narrow definitions of realism and literalism, hyperbole is what gamers in the know call unrealistic, right? But game poems can utilize hyperbole intentionally. So like in Loneliness here, where as you present these squares, right, all the other squares run away from you or seem to run away from you as you approach them, right? And that's clearly not intended as a literal representation of loneliness or how loneliness works, right? Seen through the video game lens, this is unrealistic, right? But seen through the poetry lens, it's an intentional overstatement that's attempting to indicate something about a subjective experience, right? Very different lenses. And then beyond explicit hyperbole, lyric poems have an implicit hyperbolic character, even when they're more reserved, because of their short form and tendency towards direct truth claims, right? Sometimes they're making grand claims, or sometimes they're asking you to care about a blade of grass, right? And either way, they constantly risk the reader responding with either a snicker or a shrug of their shoulders, right? Why should I believe, or why should I care? So take this observational poem by William Carlos Williams. Munching, that can't be good. Munching a plum on the street, a paper bag of them in her hands. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. In this poem, it seems that we're expected to take plums and the proposition they taste good to her, right, as somehow revelatory, right? Like this simple pleasure should be central to our experience of the world. Once again, we've been taken through a gateway to someplace far away from most video games, which are typically concerned with grand scale, grand gestures, grand objects, right? But game poems can incorporate implicit hyperbole just as well as lyric poems can. This is Ian Bogo's Slow Year, an Atari 2600 game that presents 4 short vignettes inspired by the seasons. The process of playing a slow year goes something like this. I presume no one here has played a slow year. Okay, so you start the game and don't understand what to do at all. You then search for instructions and you eventually find instructional haikus buried deep inside the physical book that comes with the game. So you attempt to decipher the instructional haikus while returning to the game, and eventually, after a lot of patience and pulling out half your hair, you determine that the goal of this first vignette is to painstakingly catch leaves as they fall off this autumnal tree. Right? So all of this for a falling leaf. Right? The game as an artifact seems to practically scream at the player, pay attention to this falling leaf. This is important. Right? And that's actually precisely one of the reasons that poets make use of hyperbole in lyric poetry, right? To call attention to the little things around us, right? That we might otherwise overlook. Where are we at? Okay, hyperbole is deeply interconnected with another central characteristic of lyric poems, which is their subjectivity. Right? So when we say the lyric poems are subjective, what we mean, of course, is that the subject is placed at center stage, right? In other words, they're personal and expressive. They often involve a first-person speaker, right? And they often privilege an exploration of the speaker's inner life or inner world. And the contrast here is to historical forms like the epic, right? Or the drama, which are concerned to different extents with quote-unquote objective, right? Object-oriented outer world relationships and meaning. As an example, here's the start of a Sarton poem. Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I've been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces. Right, so this poem presents a typically lyric concern with inner life and inner reality, right, which can't be objectively judged. Right. Now, sometimes people get tired of the subjective nature of lyric poems, right? All the expression of inner feelings, yada, 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 right? But the subjective interest of lyric poetry is actually quite an intriguing consideration when considering video games, right? Because video games have always been primarily concerned with objective reality, object-oriented reality, the outer world, right? Spaceships flying, rackets and balls colliding, people driving cars and shooting guns, etc. Right. So against this sort of backdrop, a game poem like Tale of Tales, the Graveyard, which is a short game in which you guide an old woman through a cemetery, in case you haven't played it, right, is striking for how it seeks to foreground not physical objects in space, right, but the experience of a subject wandering through an inner landscape, right, of experiences, memories, and emotions, right? Aside from being black and white, the graveyard actually looks pretty similar to what you might see in a typical 3D action game, right? If you think of something like Super Mario or Tomb Raider, right? But rather than the smooth, fluid movement you've come to expect in games like these, right? Moving our avatar in the graveyard is a slow and excruciating process, right? Instead of running through the landscape, just kind of interacting bodily with everything you see, which is the video game norm, here you can only sort of plod forward and reflect on your situation. And that turns out to be precisely the point, right? When we reach this bench, the old woman sits down and a long folk song plays out in her head. And there's nothing at all to do in the world of objects while this song plays out, right? So the game really hinges on the moment of realization that the objective relationships on display are not the ones that matter here. It's the old woman as subject who's interesting, right? Her inner life, her memories, her spiritual beliefs, right? This is a video game imagined as a very different sort of passage or gateway from what we're used to. And you can see this same emphasis on subjective inner experience in games like Loneliness and Passage as well. And of course, what each of these games ultimately facilitates is the player reflecting on their own life, which brings us to poetic address. So poetic address is more complex and ambiguous than prose address, right? Than simple communication. Poems often read more like you're overhearing something. There's this long-standing idea of utterance overheard in lyric poetry. There's often the question of who is speaking to whom or to what, and the answer often has multiple facets, right? A fictional speaker may be addressing a fictional audience or object, right? But that fictional speaker may be speaking for the poet themselves in some sort of direct way, right? And the fictional audience may actually represent the poem's reader, for instance. Right, so as an example, here's Goeth's Wanderer's Night Song. Above all summits, it is calm. In all the treetops, you feel scarcely a breath. The birds in the forest are silent. Just wait. Soon you also will rest. So who is the you in this poem? Is this intended as a simple fictional address, or is the poet addressing the reader directly? Or is Goethe actually addressing himself here? I'd say all three modes of address are present in the poem. Right? And needless to say, the question of ambiguous address and who is speaking to whom is not a primary concern of most video games, which are typically foreground other questions like who is shooting whom and who is building what. Right? But games can very much invoke this idea of poetic address. Right? So one concrete way they can do this is through ambiguous shifting of perspectives. So this is a technique I utilize in a few of my games, most explicitly in Portraits of My Child, which is a tightly constrained Pico 8 game about my son's first months of life. So the controls, objectives, and representations are ambiguous throughout this game. But in the first set of vignettes, the player has what essentially amounts to sort of a third-person perspective on various representations of my infant son and attempts to guide him in some way through the sequence of birth, breathing, and breastfeeding. And then in the second set of vignettes, the game's low-resolution graphics give way to even more ambiguous blocks and washes of color, right? And a shift that perhaps indicates a change in perspective from a vantage point outside my son to maybe my son's vantage point on the world. But the mechanics of player interaction kind of complicate this interpretation, right? And then the final set of vignettes further complicates questions of perspective by including vignettes from both first-person and third-person perspectives, some of which can be read either as representing my son's perspective on another person or another person's perspective on my son, right? And I employ these ambiguous perspective shifts intentionally, right, in order to set up a kind of triangulated address between the game's player, myself as the game's creator, and the various evocations of my son, right? The game in my mind doesn't represent either a single perspective or a simple shifting perspective, right? But rather an ambiguous set of perspectives within perspectives, right? Designed to continuously raise questions of how the self relates to the other and who is addressing whom. Okay, last lyric characteristic for today, which is heavily dependent on all the other ones we've talked about so far, which is that lyric poems tend to exist in a ritual space rather than a narrative space. They don't tell a story so much as they make truth claims about the world and a kind of ritual moment. So if you think of a poem like Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise. Poetry scholars will say that there's something going on here besides narrative. Right, the poem that this poem represents utterance more than narrative, and not fictional utterance, right? But a kind of real life utterance in a ritual context, right? And that's very common for lyric poems. So much so that we tend to assume that most poems, even highly ambiguous short poems, are making some kind of truth claim about the world. So you have poems like Ezra Pound's In the Station of the Metro, the apparition of these faces on in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. All right, and this poem has been read as a multi-layered commentary on the human condition. Despite its brevity and ambiguity, this is the entire poem here. And now we know that many video games, in addition to being long, right, have a strong emphasis on narrative, right? But can they also be gateways to these poetic realms of ritual moment and truth claim, right? And if you look here, this is Pip and Bar's A Series of Gunshots, a very simple game involving a series of urban and suburban vignettes where, as the player, you press any key and you see a window light up and hear the sound of a gunshot. Right, you can do this once or twice, and after a few scenes like this, the game ends. When it was released, A Series of Gunshots got a lot of attention and praise for its treatment of gun violence. Right, David Rudin wrote an article for Killscreen titled A Series of Gunshots Calls Out Senseless Gun Violence in Games. Right, and Paolo Pedercini called it a minimalist gem that may be the most poignant playable commentary on gun violence to date. And I don't disagree with these kinds of statements, but these statements are also interesting because if we read this game literally as a simple piece of representational media, the only clear claim that it's making is something like shots were fired, right? So I would argue that the game is in many ways closer to Ezra Pound's ambiguous Metro poem than it is to being a traditional commentary, right? So why do we want to read the game as making a truth claim? Right? Why do we believe that it's saying something about gun violence beyond what it depicts representationally? I would argue that the reason we tend to read the game this way is precisely because it has transformed into a lyric interface. It is a poetic gateway. It is short, metaphoric, hyperbolic, and ritualistic, right, in the time-honored tradition of poetry. So the question I asked at the beginning of this talk was, can the interface architecture of poetry be made to operate in video games? And we've only had time to look at a few examples, right? But I think the answer is clearly yes. And so, and this is exciting to me, and this is I dive into this in quite a bit more detail in my book, right? So I point you there again if you want to go into more details. Then we can go through in a 45-minute talk, right? But this is exciting to me because it allows us to sort of define this idea, or one idea, right, for a Born-Videogame Poetics, and to develop a framework for thinking specifically and concretely, right, about how we might conceive of something as a game poem. And there are a couple of other characteristics that in the book that I haven't talked about at all, but yeah, so more thoroughly in my book, right? But this project for me isn't primarily about categorization, all right? It's not primarily about defining a new class of artifacts that sits between video games and poems. Rather, it's about how we can articulate video games as gateways to new types of experiences, right? The beauty to me of interface thinking is that whenever we talk about interfaces, we're reminded that things don't exist in a vacuum, right? We're talking about things connected to other things connected to people, right? It changes the emphasis from what is this thing, right, to what is this thing for? What does this thing do? What kind of experiences does this thing mediate, right? And this is where I think the higher stakes are. Because as we've discussed, games have most often been gateways to violent, adrenaline-filled, object-oriented experiences, right? And the reason for that, I think, is ultimately inseparable from the various systems that video games are deeply entangled with, right? If we look over the landscape of video games, broadly speaking, it's easy to agree with Galloway's claim that the virtual is no longer a site of emancipation, right, but rather a mechanism of oppression, right? Games tend to perpetuate the values of the systems and infrastructures they inhabit, right? Attention economies, platform capitalism, extractive markets of data and labor, right? They're interfaces that take us into worlds which teach us over and over again to value mastery, optimization, accumulation, and destruction, to see the world as system, object, and resource. Right? So the idea of a game poem is exciting to me, not primarily because it posits that a video game can have this or that formal characteristic, right? But because it positions video games as, or attempts to position video games, right, as a legitimate medium of poetic expression, right, which offers us hope of video games that are gateways into very different sorts of experiences, right? Environments, emotions, encounters, perspectives, ideologies, and politics compared to the landscape that is currently before us, right? Which offers us hope of video games maybe that are sites of emancipation, to borrow Galloway's language. Poems, says Mary Oliver, are not words after all, but fires for the cold, right? Ropes let down to the lost. Poetry, says Alice Walker, is the lifeblood of rebellion, revolution, and the raising of consciousness, right? These are the sorts of games I want to make. These are the sorts of games I want to see more of in the world. Games that are fires for the cold, right? Games that are the lifeblood of the raising of consciousness. And to get there, we need to explode the idea not just of what games are, right? But also what they are for. All right, what sorts of mediations they facilitate, what sorts of interfaces they can be. Right, and there's another interface on the other side of video games that we also have to explode, which is the interface between people and the means of creation, right? Because of course, these things are inseparable, right? If we want to see new types of games being made, we have to invite new types of people to make games, right? And that's ultimately what excites me most about the idea of a game poem, right? And where I think the highest stakes are in reimagining how games can be made, right? The idea that anyone can sit down with a small accessible tool and craft a tiny expressive game in a similar fashion to how they might jot down a haiku or doodle on a napkin, right? This is a really exciting idea to me, right? And something that I think is quite subversive when it comes to video games, right? And spreading that idea is a big part of why I wrote this book. And it's why I regularly give workshops showing how anyone from any background, right, can make a game poem from scratch in just 2 or 3 hours, right? And I'm actually giving one of these tomorrow in Oslo. I've also started a community of practice around this idea, right? Encouraging artists and poets and people from all sorts of backgrounds to make tiny, expressive video games. And as Camilla said, we've just launched a new online literary magazine, which you can check out at gamepoems.org. And the first issue is coming out just next month, actually. So that's quite exciting. So injunction time. So you know where I'm going. At the beginning of this talk, I promised you an injunction because, hey, injunctions are fun. But also because I do think there are real ethical and political stakes here, right? So my playful injunction is this: if interfaces are gateways, right, and game poems can open new gateways for video games, and anyone can make a game poem, then go make a game poem, right? Help us build some new gateways, right? I'm going to leave you with an adapted quote from Annie Dillard, which, of course, she's talking about poetry, but maybe this is what we can imagine. Why are we playing video games if not in hope of beauty laid bare, life heightened, and its deepest mystery probed? Why are we playing video games if not in the hope that the creator will magnify and dramatize our days, will illuminate and inspire us with wisdom, courage, and the possibility of meaningfulness, and will press upon our minds the deepest mysteries so we may feel again their majesty and power? So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for putting up with me and for having me here. Much appreciated.